title, Blood Money, Tony paced the dark, empty streets. His chest still ached, but the pain was nothing compared to the weight of the message that had burned into his mind. You have 24 hours. The city was a ghost town in the early morning hours, but Tony wasn't fooled. He knew that somewhere out there, someone was watching, waiting. His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with a new message. The clock is ticking. He gritted his teeth and shoved the phone back into his jacket pocket. The only place he knew to look for answers was the old man who'd been his father's closest associate. Salvatore had trusted him, and Tony figured he had no other choice but to turn to him now. The old warehouse on the outskirts of the city looked as dilapidated as ever. The windows were boarded up, and the rusted steel door creaked as Tony pushed it open. He stepped inside, the smell of mold and dust heavy in the air. Anyone home? Tony's voice echoed, but no one answered. He took a few more steps inside, scanning the room. A low growl came from the corner, and Tony's eyes narrowed. A figure emerged from the shadows, the old man, Luca, the ghost Mancini. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, but his presence was still as imposing as ever. I figured you'd come eventually, Luca rasped, his voice rough with age. Tony didn't waste time. You know something. I need answers. Luca studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. Your father wasn't just a butcher, Tony. He made deals. Dangerous ones. Tony's pulse quickened. Deals? With who? Luca took a step closer, his gaze never leaving Tony's. The kind of people who don't forgive debts easily. People who don't just take your money, they take your soul. Tony frowned. What the hell are you talking about? Luca sighed, sitting down on an old crate. It's not just money, Tony. It's blood. The Calabrese name, it's cursed. Your father sold more than just cuts of meat. He sold the lives of those who owed him, and now it's your turn to pay. Tony felt his stomach tighten. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. His father, the man who had raised him, was involved in something. This? But why is it happening now? Tony asked, his voice barely a whisper. Luca's eyes flickered to something behind Tony. He stood, his voice barely audible. Because someone's come to collect. Before Tony could turn around, a cold, hollow laugh filled the air. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Tony's breath became visible. You didn't think you could outrun your father's sins, did you, Tony? The voice was the same deep, unnatural one he had heard before. Tony spun around, but the figure was already there, standing in the doorway. It was the man in the black trench coat. His glowing yellow eyes locked onto Tony's. Luca's voice trembled. You need to leave, Tony. You need to leave now. But it was too late. The man stepped forward, the air around him rippling with a dark, unsettling energy. You've been given your chance, the figure said, his voice like gravel grinding against stone. Now your debt must be paid. Tony's heart pounded in his chest. What do you want from me? He shouted, his voice raw with fear. The figure tilted his head, his smile slow and knowing. Your soul, Tony, your soul. Suddenly, the warehouse door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. The shadows grew, stretching and swirling as if they had a life of their own. Tony reached for his gun, but his hands were shaking too violently. You can't escape this, the figure said, his voice echoing from every corner of the room. The Calabrese bloodline has always been cursed, and you are the last of them. Luca let out a strangled cry, but before Tony could react, the floor beneath them began to crack open, a thick, black mist rising from the cracks. Run, Tony! Lucas screamed. Run! Tony didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted toward the door, but it was no use. The mist closed in, swirling around him like a suffocating embrace. His heart raced as the shadows closed in on his every side. The dark figure laughing louder now, the sound more twisted. He reached the door, but as his hand touched the handle, something sharp grabbed his ankle and yanked him back. He screamed, his fingers scraping the door frame. The figure's eyes gleamed as he stepped forward. You can't escape your fate, Tony. The debt has already been paid. You're just late for the final transaction. The last thing Tony saw before he was swallowed by the darkness was Luca's face, his eyes wide with terror, mouthing a final word. Run. To be continued.